when people finally make change, it's because the pain of not changing becomes greater than the pain that you're going to have to go through to make the change.
Even though it was pretty terrifying at the time when I went through that transition, but those were some of the things that pushed me into this direction. Industry research is different. The types of problems that you're solving, the whole vocabulary that is involved in it.
You probably learned faster that way than you could have otherwise. What would you say was the biggest mistake that you made?
I was afraid to ask those kinds of questions. That was really my mistake. I think you can learn so much just by kind of like opening yourself up to talking to different people and looking at different directions.
Tired of endless grant writing and the limitations of academia, Claire Snell-Rood made a bold pivot to the world of UX and product research, and she hasn't looked back. With a PhD in anthropology and years of experience tackling global public health challenges, Claire brings a unique perspective to the tech industry. In today's episode, we'll explore how Claire transitioned from academia to agency work, then into an in-house UX research role, and what she's learned about applying research in real-world settings. I'm your host, Chris Abad, and this is Pixelated Path. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode filled with inspiring stories and actionable advice. Let's jump in. Claire, you've had an amazing career in academia. You have your PhD in anthropology. You've taught at Berkeley. You've taught at University of Virginia. You've done field studies in India, rural Appalachia. Like, what drew you to that field of work in the first place?
I have been interested in anthropology since really the end of high school. I was really lucky when I was a senior because we had this opportunity to do these independent studies. And I had been exposed to sociology, but then I kind of came across an anthropology book or two in this used bookstore in town. And I got to do this independent study that year. And this one book I read, it was called, and it really just opened my eyes to this completely different way of asking questions and understanding. And just kind of in brief, what this book is about is it asks the question of how our mothers in this really poor region of Brazil, why are they reacting in the way that they are when there's so many of their children are dying because there's such immense poverty and they don't seem to have attachment. And this was really labeled as pathological in many ways. And this anthropologist went and she lived in this community and she said, well, it makes sense why they're reacting in this way because this is an area of perpetual hardship. It's impossible to form lasting attachment. We need to understand what this is and why it is and what the bonds are and how they develop over time rather than just criticizing them. So there's something about this way of asking a different question that kind of turned things on its head for me. So when I went to college, and that's what I studied, and I loved the way that anthropology could take any type of place, whether that's a hair salon or, a sports stadium or, the floor of a stock exchange and turn that into a place where you can learn about how people live and how all kinds of very big things happen, even in small interactions. So that was kind of what got me into it. And then I think over time, I became really excited by not only the types of questions that anthropology could ask, but the way that it would come up with fundamentally different perspectives and answers that I think kind of helped me to rethink like what are the types of values and social impact that we want to make that might be really different? What are the pieces of our assumptions that maybe we need to question? So that's what kind of drew me to anthropology.
We talk to a lot of people who come from different fields and different backgrounds and different areas of study and then find their way, mostly because, 10, 15 plus years ago, like UX wasn't as an established practice, so you couldn't go to school for it. And so naturally people are coming from other fields. You had like an established career in academia before coming into UX. So what drove that change?
It's a great question. I think I had always been a bit ambivalent about academia, really even from the time I went into graduate school. I loved the field of anthropology and thought it was fascinating, but I felt really frustrated with the lack of application. We learn these amazing things, so what? What do we do with them? But I kept on that journey because I kept having these really amazing opportunities to either do research that I really believed in with partners I believed in, like the work that I did in India or the work that I did in Appalachia. And then over time, I was getting these opportunities to apply that research as well. But kind of over time, I think I wasn't able to do the type of application that I had hoped to. And I think also the way that a lot of academia is structured, particularly in fields like public health, which is what I transitioned into as an anthropologist doing public health, you really have to run your research kind of like you're a startup, a really small startup. So you end up spending most of your time raising money to run your research lab and really relying on, donor priorities in order to shape which direction you're going in. And that ended up not being quite the right fit for me, even though I loved the research that I was doing and I loved my students and colleagues. And I realized that doing UX research and product research really ended up being a viable path for me to apply this research perspective that I had. And at the same time, frankly, on the personal front, I had a lot of changes happening as well. And taking this kind of career transition, I felt would really give me a lot of long-term security. So it's been really rewarding, even though it was pretty terrifying at the time when I went through that transition. But those were some of the things that pushed me into this direction so that I could have a much more applied way to use my research.
Making big leaps like that can be pretty scary, which you mentioned. And I think I just heard this yesterday about people making change. And when people finally make change, it's because the pain of not changing becomes greater than the pain that you're going to have to go through to make the change. Because, life changes like that can be painful. Was there something in particular that was there like a catalyst moment or something either that happened at work or what drove you to that point?
I think when I had started at Berkeley, I knew that I was giving myself a period of time, 5 years, and I said, let's see what I can do. Let's see what I can get started. And I think I had started a number of new community partnerships, and I had started with just building this work out here in California related to rural behavioral health. But there were just a number of challenges in terms of securing funding. And so all along, I kind of had this thought of there's a good chance that I may want to transition into another way of doing research. And, as that time went on, I realized, I'm ready to take that. Ready to take that direction now. And at the same time, I think, the farther I went in terms of this specific path of doing research, the more time I was spending doing grant writing and, writing revisions of papers, and the less time I was spending really with the types of community research partners and doing research myself that I had really hoped to, and that was really the most valuable for me. So my hope was that I could be able to really kind of get back out there in terms of doing more research and being able to spend more time actually talking about the implications of that work and turning that into actions and impact in the real world. And I've found that industry has been an amazing way to do that. Not to say that you can't do that in academia. This ended up being the right path for me.
So moving out of academia and into industry so that you could see more application of the research you're doing, getting away from the cycle of funding your research and all of that. That makes sense. UX is one specific place that you could go. Did you consider other paths, or was it always I want to go into UX and do research there?
I did consider some other paths. I had considered there are a number of nonprofit research institutes that really go at research like a team. They become these grant powerhouses where they have, multidisciplinary teams who will put in for multiple different projects. And I had considered that route. There's a lot of really amazing research that gets done in institutes like that. But I think that at the end of my time in academia, I was really ready for a pivot. I was ready for a different type of research. And there was something exciting about just the fact that industry represented, I don't know, maybe it was the grass is greener, but I think that I knew from all the conversations I had while networking that there was a way that I would be right in the trenches if I were to do UX research. And I think that kind of as I went on in conversations and I talked to researchers at a number of different types of companies, it also became clear to me that I was a bit better suited for a more product research role than, say, one that was, squarely UX research as well, in part because of the fact that I think my training and orientation as a researcher is much more exploratory and oriented toward discovery. And I ended up in roles that really kind of span, the UX product research kind of continuum. But it was those types of conversations that helped me to think through what is this field here and what is the best place for me to position myself within it.
Can you say more about that? Because sometimes those terms can be used interchangeably. But for you, what's the difference between a UX research focus and a product research focus?
That's a great question. So I think this is definitely something that has been, for me, guided by, my mentor and colleague at Rippling, Jenny Doe Byrne. And I think to me, product research is really about thinking through not only what the experience of the product is by a specific user, but also thinking about product strategy and opportunities. So I think it's in part, it's thinking about what's strategic for the business as a whole. And sometimes that doesn't always mean the best user experience, though that is really nice. But I think it can also be about thinking through, what are segments that are unreached? What is the bare minimum of a need that needs to be addressed? How does that need to be packaged and put together out there in the world? And I think looking at the industry as a whole, not just the single product itself.
Can you unpack that a little bit more when you said it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best user experience? Do you mean that you may focus on something other than user experience, or you may actually make trade-offs in the user experience to do what's best for the company?
It means both. I feel like you made it so easy for me by giving me those two options. I think that sometimes it's just about those hard conversations about, with the resources we have as a business, what does it make sense to prioritize and what gives us the most bang for its buck. And then I think some of it also just means before the user experience, thinking about, what are the fundamental problems that we're trying to solve and how are those lived within specific organizations and industries, and identifying, what are the opportunities to solve those and which are the problems that are really worth solving, because they aren't all worth solving.
Interesting. So a lot of what you're talking about getting into more like business strategy, is that something that you feel like you learned some transferable skills in your prior field of study and research, or is that something that you picked up between leaving academia and your current role at Rippling?
I would say it's certainly, there are some foundational skills that I got from within academia. And those foundational skills, I think, are really always within research. You have to ask the question of, why are we doing this work? Why is this an important question to ask? And then once you've learned it, who cares? What's the significance? What do we need to do differently? And with the work that I was doing, with the questions of, what do we need to do differently? Oftentimes that had implications for how do we need to deliver behavioral health care services differently? What are the implications for policy? how do we need to do things differently out there in the world? Everything from, that micro level of how care is delivered and how it is lived and how we support patients, all the way up to, what needs to be reimbursed by insurance. So that piece of recommendation on multiple levels is something that certainly I brought from my training. But I think that in terms of what the application is to business, that's something that I learned on the job, both within an agency, working with different companies and trying to figure out where they are in their life cycle and what problems they're trying to solve. And then certainly within Rippling in the last few years.
I want to go back to that shift that you made from academia to specifically working at an agency. How did that come up?
So at that point in time that I knew I needed to start to make this transition, and I was learning about different opportunities and just networking with different researchers, I came upon an opportunity sort of fell into my lap through this networking because I knew that I needed to start developing a portfolio in industry research. I had already had, 15 years of qualitative research. But the thing that was really clear to me is that I needed industry research if I was going to ever be considered for product research. So I sort of put it out there that I was looking for some type of experience, and I had an opportunity land in my lap to work with an agency called Forge that was based in the US in the Bay Area. And they had a whole lot of business at the time. They didn't have enough researchers on staff. And so I worked with Becky Buck there, who was one of the co-founders and the lead researcher. And it was this incredible opportunity. Basically, she said, "We've got work." And I said, "Okay, great. What do you want me to do?" And she hands me a project and walks me through it and then says, "Okay, we'll check in tomorrow." And so it was just this real amazing chance for me to just hit the ground running. And I would check in daily with her. She would kind of help me to refine how I'm asking questions, how I'm presenting. She really helped me to start to think about how can I communicate what I am learning visually and to think through what the implications of the work are for businesses rather than the types of implications that I would write up for research beforehand. And the amazing thing about that experience as well is, Forge had all different types of clients. We had Grammarly as a client. We had a couple of different kind of like contractor platforms as clients. We had the government as a client. So it was this way for me to get into projects at all different stages of the kind of discovery evaluation continuum, but also how to work with all different types of clients. So it was an amazing boot camp for me. And I also got to work alongside of designers. It was a really friendly atmosphere to work in. So that was really exactly what I needed as I was making this transition and trying on new ways of describing research, but also in a just really positive, affirming setting.
Any sort of change people make, for example, in your case, from academia into industry, sometimes it's frustrating because there's sort of this barrier getting in because you need the experience before you get the experience, but you need to get the role to get so it's like this whole chicken or egg thing. And I think it can be frustrating for a lot of people because especially when you have a ton of experience, like you say, you have 15 years of experience. Looking back now that you've developed the portfolio, developed the industry research experience, do you feel like those barriers are fair, or do you feel like your prior experience is overly discounted?
That's such a great question. I do feel like those barriers are fair. Industry research is different. The types of problems that you're solving, the whole vocabulary that is involved in it, the ways that you are conducting research and bringing people along and really kind of what is the expected output are all different from how you do it within academia. They're just different cultural worlds. So they both share research. They're huge and massive transferable skills between both of them, but you have to work yourself through this different structure and world in order to know it and to know how to operate smoothly within it. What I wish is that there were, I think, maybe more structured pathways in so that people who have a research background and are interested, can get that chance. But I'm not sure that the structured pathways will ever take place. And I think that in a way that's also okay, because so much of the world of research, qualitative research, social research, really, I think is about being able to form relationships, find people, skip between different things, try out different things. And so that's part of how you find your way in. I think the main challenge is just that, not all of our networks are created equal. And so that means it's a lot easier for some people to get that first gig in than others. And so that's where I wish there was more formality and opportunity is how to help those people who don't have the same networks.
I think it's another sometimes chicken or egg problem, especially people who are just starting their careers. And so they haven't had opportunities to build up their network. And, everyone says you need a network so that you can get your next role. What advice would you have for someone who is at the beginning, maybe they're fresh out of school and they know they need to network, but like you said, there aren't a whole lot of formalized structures. Did you find anything that worked for you that maybe someone in that position could emulate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I ended up gradually developing a more formal approach to networking. And part of this came with some guidance that I had from a career coach that I worked with during that period in time, who basically said to me, Claire, you are going to talk to 50 people during this phase of looking for a job. You are going to write down each one of their names. You're going to write down how you got to know them. You're going to write down what you learned from the conversation, and then you're going to write down any follow-up you have later. And so I had that kind of as like my baseline, very clear goals, a way of kind of mapping out how I knew people, being able to follow up with people. And at the same time, I think one thing that happened over time was getting better at figuring out how to have these kinds of conversations with people. And that is figuring out, okay, I have a chance to talk to this one person. What is the thing that makes sense for me to learn from this person? I want to learn specific things about their organization. Do I want to learn specific things about their career trajectory? Are there specific problems that they solve that I want to know how they solve them? So before I still do this, before I meet and chat with someone, I figure out everything that I can about them that will answer any of those questions before I go into the call. Because I think one thing that's challenging for those people who are being networked with, as someone who now has a number of people reach out to me to ask me, how do you do this? Is when someone asks you a question and the information is already readily available. You want, that person to ask you something that they couldn't have got otherwise. So make the most of your time by doing that work ahead of time. And I guess I would also say, it's not, I think a lot of times with networking, we think that it's always most valuable when you talk to the most important person or like the person who's higher up the food chain. And I think particularly for people who are junior, and that has been me, talking to the people who are in the trenches and on the front lines and lower in the food chain can be immensely helpful. They have been there recently. They are close to your experience. They remember what it's like. They can give you really clear tips. And they're in many ways motivated to kind of want to connect you to the next person or the next thing because they feel that pain. They were just asking people for help too. So I would say just think about networking expansively, but also think about it as its own research project and make it super easy for the people who you're networking with. If you're suggesting a time, make sure you're suggesting a time in their time zone. Make sure that you are minimizing the number of back and forth that they have to do with you.
I'm sure you recognize this, but you've certainly taken a researcher's approach to networking. But I love how very specific and structured and tangible you made a lot of that. And like you said, it's probably because like this was not that long ago that you were learning this and had to go through this to form your network. So that was amazing. I really appreciate that. I want to go back to your starting out at Forge. I know Becky really well. She's amazing. And I think it was such a great fit for you when she gave you these problems and sort of sent you off to kind of figure them out. You probably learned faster that way than you could have otherwise. But the trade-off with learning faster is probably because you made a lot of your own mistakes along the way. So what was, looking back, what would you say was the biggest mistake that you made or learning experience, depending on how you want to frame it?
While I was at Forge, I think that it took me a little while to really figure out what this connection between research and design was. And part of that was because design was so foreign to me. It was foreign to me as a practice in terms of I didn't have the same attention to all of these kind of industry patterns and really as an art form. And so I think that there were some misses that I had in terms of parts of design that I wish I had started to pay attention to more, ways that I think I wish I had engaged more with what designers were saying, in part because I think I should have just said, hey, here's this whole other professional field. How do you want to observe it in the same way that you observe and make sense of any other field? And I think at times I was just so overwhelmed by the hugeness of it and that I didn't take that type of open approach to, I think, to seeing it like an anthropological problem, like I do a lot of other things. And I think that would have served me well and helped me to see some of the structures and patterns and values earlier on.
Not recognizing that, what does that look like in practice? Like, did you butt heads with designers? Did you?
I didn't butt heads with designers. I think that I missed the opportunity to ask more questions about, why did you choose this? Or what does this mean? And one thing that Becky, I don't know if she's ever said this to you, but she said this to me, never be afraid to ask the dumb question, because it's really not a dumb question. And almost always when you ask it, it forces people to come up with a really thoughtful answer. And I was afraid to ask those kinds of questions because I was so new in this field. I was coming from this culture of academia of like expert knowledge, just like don't reveal if you don't know what's going on. And I think that was really my mistake, was not asking more of those kind of fundamental questions of what are you doing here? Why are you doing this? Can you explain this to me? I think it would have helped me to engage my colleagues a little bit more deeply.
How did you get over that? I assume you feel more comfortable now asking dumb questions.
I'm still in recovery from that, Chris. I think there is this challenge of like the dumb question. There are certain dumb questions you can ask, and there's other ones that you can't. And this is something I've always observed from the beginning of my career as an anthropologist. There are some things you should just shut up and watch and see what you can observe and pick up. But I would say I am getting better at asking some of those questions, but I still have work to do there for sure. I think in part, I'm just also so amazed by just design as a fundamentally different way of solving problems. It's so, it's structured, It's obviously visual. I think it involves kind of mapping out all of the different options from the outset in a way that I admire and I'm also a little bit intimidated by. So I will maintain my awe, but also, I do ask those questions, but I still need to ask more of them. And I think that can also be exacerbated in a lot of tech workplaces too, because I think there can be a real kind of performative, like a very confident style of communication that is preferred, and I would say more the cultural norm as well.
As an anthropologist, what else do you see about tech culture, like habits or maybe like things that you just find odd that don't exist? We're in this big like echo chamber, and a lot like I've spent my whole life in this space, and so I probably don't know any better. But what do you find puzzling?
You're getting me in trouble now, Chris. I think as with any industry, I think that there can just be there is deep knowledge of this industry, and I think that sometimes an awareness of its norms and its workplaces and its needs. And I think that a lot of times that can carry over into bias in our products. We assume that, because we're on our computers all day long, then obviously, all workforces and all people are on their computers all day long, and therefore our products should reach people through that medium. And that's just not the case. And I think that, whether it has to do with, say, for instance, rippling, I think that something that we're working on a lot as a company is trying to figure out, like, how can we build better for industries that don't look like us as a company? How can we build for industries with, manufacturing workforces or predominantly contractor workforces or, retail? And it just requires kind of stepping outside of our ideas of what a worker is and what a worker needs and what, good worker performance is, and kind of stepping out and figuring out what are these fundamentally different ways of being in the world. So, I would say that's the main challenge, is like, how does our bias kind of feed into the types of products that we create and the ways that we understand needs and how to solve for those needs.
So after Forge, then you landed at Rippling. What was that transition like? Because we talked earlier about some of the barriers and difficulties of going from academia to agency, and I think you have maybe not as high, but similar barriers when you're trying to go from agency to in-house. So what was that like for you?
Yeah. So I knew that I wanted to switch in-house to in-house from agency. And part of that was because I wanted to be able to have this deeper continued engagement with, a certain number of products and how those products relate to each other, but also to all of the teams that were involved in them. So, some of the skills that are involved in that kind of, that sustained engagement are not unlike that of what you do when you're in academia and you have a community-based partnership, which is something that a lot of social scientists have. You develop this partnership over time, you carry it, it evolves, priorities change, resources change, but, it's sustained over time. So I felt like I wanted that, and I was able to take some of the skills into that. But I certainly needed to prove it to my colleagues that I was able to do that. And I think it was also like really learning a new language too, because you need to know this new product inside and out in a way that you don't when you are working on a single contract for an agency and a very specific problem that you're trying to solve. When you're in-house, you need to understand all of the different pieces of this product and not only how they interact, but also, what are the implications for where we're going next. And that can be challenging, particularly at a company like Rippling, because we are always just the number of products that are popping off the shelf is kind of astronomical. So it's a lot to keep up with. And I guess I would also say, one challenge is that, I wish I had treated rippling as if it were a field site, because there is that learning curve of learning in the new product spaces and, all the specific types of challenges that will make up your core questions as a researcher. But I think I wish I had paid more attention to the org as its own field site. What are all the different, business units within? How are they interacting? What is their, what's their voice? What's their power? Who are all the different kind of power players within my org? What's their voice look like? Who are the people who are leading from behind? I think it took me a little bit longer to pay attention to that whole landscape and kind of treat that as, as my field site or vision, because I think that could have helped me be a little bit more effective from the outset. But I got there.
I mean, certainly when the goal is to get things done, get changes in the product, get more value out to the customer, as the organization grows, I think you start to realize that it becomes more of this mix of what you do with the product and also what you do within the organization and how you navigate the organization. Having been through that curve and maybe realizing that looking back, you could have gone through that curve sooner. Do you have any other suggestions for someone who's maybe brand new at a large company and what should they do to maybe not fall into the same trap that you did?
I think just to realize that you believe at the outset that you have these specific deliverables and things that you are publicly accountable for. And so for me, that is, I have to do 2 to 4 research projects a quarter. And, this is how many participants I have to recruit. These are all the ways I need to socialize that research. But I think it will help to think about just a broader set of goals for yourself. There are those deliverables, those things you have to take across. But I think, what are the other types of things that you want to observe and, maybe it's formally document, maybe it's just reflect at the end of the day about how are people working together? What is not working together? What are your thoughts about it and reflections? I think it took me a long time to have my own point of view about how people were communicating or not communicating, because it was all so new. And I think to have just very intentional reflections about the company culture and how you want to act and experiment in and be effective in that company culture, I think can really help with that transition. And to bring along other mentors and team members to have those reflections together, what's working for you? I'm trying this. Let's both report back and see what happens, because there's not one way to do it.
Going through that thought process, do you feel like you have been able to make any changes within Rippling, either the way decisions are made or communication happens or culture of the team?
Yeah, I think that I have tried to bring excitement to the way that we do research on platform, which is my team. This is a really focused team. It's the middleware of the whole product. So it's, down in the weeds. It's the hardcore technical stuff. And I think what I've really tried to do is help these product spaces come alive in terms of really what their implications are for the people who use our product. It's not just, okay, how are people using data? It is, do people feel safe with how they're setting up permissions? If they get it wrong, what does that mean for them? It means their head might be on the chopping block. That's why they're using the product in this specific way, because they need to be able to get it right. So there's that piece certainly of user empathy, but I think really it's about kind of showing what this product means in the real world. That has implications all the way from, what the design is and kind of what the user experience is, but also in terms of thinking through how important are these problems in terms of people wanting to invest in a specific solution for them. So I think also I think one change that I've hoped to bring in terms of, I wouldn't say it's the culture so much, but just the kind of conversation that happens around research is just curiosity. I would say Rippling as a company is really nerdy, which I really like. I feel like there's a lot of people who love to just kind of dig, just get into the details, understand the why, and really engage. And so I think particularly as in terms of some new product spaces that we're investing in, it's been really fun to bring different perspectives on, what could this mean for this industry? What could this mean for this type of, for this business unit? What makes sense and what doesn't? And to really push these perspectives out there and get people in conversation so that we can use the evidence to help drive the conversation. I think because there's, both this excitement about what we're building, but also curiosity about what it can mean out there in the real world, it's been fun to kind of take that approach.
I want to play devil's advocate for a minute, because I think from the outside, you hear like platform and research together and like not exciting. Just for a lot of people, it's just not going to sound exciting. What is it? What do you actually do? Like, is it just your enthusiasm? Is it the presentation style? Is it some other like what's your delivery mechanism for excitement?
I do think that there is a kind of playful spirit that you can bring to work that can make people excited. And I think I bring that to the types of research sessions that I do. Some are certainly a little bit dry, but there's others that are really like, what are the stakes for you? What's important for you? And to laugh about the things that totally don't make sense at all, and to laugh about the really kind of hard challenges that people are trying to solve. So I think that's one part about how you can do research in an exciting way. And then I guess I also think that platform is exciting because really it's not this shiny, sexy thing, but it's the structure that holds up everything. It's underneath all of everything. And so in that way, it touches every single part of product. So to me, that's what makes it so fun to study, because it's everywhere. And, it's about kind of understanding these fundamentals of, everyone knows that data is important, but platform is about like, well, how is that data organized, and how should it be connected, and how should it be visualized? And I think, from an anthropological angle, I think it's really interesting to see this kind of contrast between like our engineers and our product leads who are structuring a product. How do they think that it makes sense for data to be accessible versus how HR admins need that data to be accessible and the places that they want to encounter it, and what makes sense and what's clean and feels right and is intuitive to them versus our people who have their own training and different background in data. So there is excitement there, Chris.
I think there are different types of products or industries that are different, and people will develop sometimes an expertise in that area, but like your tactics change. I think platform is one of those. And I've seen it in other fields too. I think for an engineer who works on a platform versus maybe a user-facing product for a designer. For you, how do the tactics of doing research for a platform change versus working on a different type of product?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I would say that there are some very specific problems that you work with on platform that I think are connected to more technical types of products, like reports and how reports are structured, or, how users need to create automations. But I would say that for the most part, there are a lot of platform problems that are there are a number that are really like blank slate questions that are And I think that's what can make them a little bit different from other product spaces that are really tailored toward, this is one specific problem that this product is trying to solve. See how people are solving this problem. Whereas platform, because it's about, that middleware itself that can be used in a number of different ways, there are lots of problems that are about, okay, well, how could this blank slate be used in different industry settings or by different business units? And based on our understanding of how different people would, make art out of this blank slate, what's strategic for us? So that's a piece of it. And then there was one more part of it, I think. And I would just say the other part of it is that, because like platform is at the heart of some of these big issues about how data is used, like who has permission to use it and what data is important, you end up having these real interesting kind of slices of insight into how, because we're B2B, how specific companies work, what is valuable to them, what are the reports that they need, that they're looking at in a repeated way that, show their values about the health of a business. And also, I think with permission specifically showing pieces about, what are the stakes of who has access to what information. It reveals all of these, really kind of kinship structures, if I'm going to use an anthropology word, of like, who are the people within a specific structure that are allowed to have access to the information and why? And why is it scary if other people get that access to the information? So it's really like a social problem.
That's really interesting because I think for a lot of people, they wouldn't consider, like you said, working on a platform, it's very technical. And a lot of the end users are developers, but turning it into or thinking of it as a social problem rather than just a technical problem, I think is a different angle. Does it feel like that? Like, what do you feel like that different perspective has added or changed about how we might typically approach a very technical product or like a platform product?
I mean, I think that, for instance, I think in part it can really highlight what are the types of, like, from an immediate product perspective, like what are the types of features that need to be prioritized? So for something that's like permissions, like how much control do people need to have? What are the types of control that need to be prioritized and visualized so that you can see those first? Because we know that it's those concerns, not other concerns, that come to the fore in a patterned way. And then also from like, if you take that up to a broader perspective, I think the question is like, if you can offer at a platform level, then what does that mean in terms of the power of your product overall to be able to allow users of any one of those single products within your product suite to have control and to not have to be able to set it over and over and over again? What does that mean for how much easier their experience is going to be, but also the fact that they aren't going to have to work in separate spaces, that, they control the gates and there's so much room for error, and here are the different stakes of it. So I think you can think about it all the way from like, what's the product experience to like, at the individual user level, all the way up to kind of what does that mean for, the value proposition of your product as a whole.
A lot of our listeners are early career researchers and designers. What advice would you have for someone who is just starting their career in UX research?
I think I would say first and foremost, as someone whose career has changed a lot during the whole of it, is to treat your career, I guess I would say treat a certain career path as one that is changing. So to understand what are, I think to kind of watch careers sort of as an anthropologist or a social scientist might watch it, to ask, what are these different roles that exist right now? Where are the places that I can get that job? What is the path to it? what is important to me? And also, like, what are other areas that might be adjacent to that I might be interested in, I might not consider right now, but so that I can understand all of the different possibilities for me. And in part, I think to not treat careers or a specific type of job as something that is static. I think that one thing that has served me really well over the course of my career is that I've always been interested in some type of applied anthropology. This is, though product research and industry research is new to me, I've been asking these questions about what are ways I can apply research from the very beginning. It shaped, how I learned to ask different questions, what I engaged with, who I talked to. It helped to make me more flexible. So I would just say, don't take it for granted that a job is going to stay the same or be one thing, but not only track how those are different, but also track what's valuable to you and be open to making those changes. You can be creative in your approach, and I think you can learn so much just by kind of like opening yourself up to talking to different people and looking at different directions.
One of the biggest challenges I think people run into early in their career is trying to get past this imposter syndrome. What message would you have for someone who is maybe in that mode and doubting their ability to be successful in this field?
That is such a huge challenge. I've dealt with that a lot. And I have a couple of different techniques that I use that come from some training that I got while I was a faculty member. And one of it is just to kind of understand what those feelings are and find ways to let them out, but also recognize when those feelings are getting in the way of you doing your work. If you're in the middle of writing something and you're in the middle of a meeting and you have those feelings come out, write down one line, let it out, put it to the side, and then get back into it and focus. Part of those feelings are there in part to protect us. They're kind of like this weird way, like this harsh inner critic. And so we need to find a way to deal with them effectively. And I think another part of it is really to have accountability buddies. So people can help you focus on your goals, but who can also help you kind of deal with those feelings and affirm you with the small successes that you have in everyday life. I have an accountability that I've had, for the past, 10 years now. And this is someone who was a professional colleague and has become a good friend who I check in with to help with kind of just the structure of everyday work and goals, but also in terms of affirming how we are growing and what we're doing in our everyday practice. So find that person or develop that network of people because we all need it and it helps us.
Amazing. Thank you again so much for providing such like very specific and tangible tips on how to work through things like that. Claire, this has been an amazing conversation. I appreciate it so much. If people wanted to either follow your work or connect with you online, where could they do that?
Best place is just LinkedIn. Yep. Send me a connection request or send me a message and I'm happy to have a conversation.
Great. Thanks again. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for the conversation, Chris.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate it.
And that wraps up our conversation with Claire Snell-Rood. What an inspiring story of career reinvention. From her time in academia to thriving in the tech world, Claire's journey shows the power of adaptability, networking, and persistence. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on more career insights from UX leaders and innovators. Thanks for watching. I'm Chris Abad, and we'll see you next time on Pixelated Path.